In this video, I'm going to show how to send and receive MimbleWimble Coin with Ledger Live Desktop. To start, I'll go to the fork of Ledger Live Desktop that includes MimbleWimble Coin support. Then I'll go to its newest release. Here you can find downloadable versions for Linux, Mac OS, and Windows. But before I download the software, I'm going to install the MimbleWimble Coin app on my hardware wallet. The newest version of the app isn't available on Ledger Live Desktop yet, so I'll need to install it manually. To do that, I'll go to the link in the release's description to go to the GitHub page for the MimbleWimble Coin hardware wallet app. I'll scroll down to the bottom of the building section where there's a link to a web installer for the app. Once it loads, there'll be options to install apps for MimbleWimble Coin, MimbleWimble Coin floonet, Grin, and Grin testnet. I'll click the button to install the MimbleWimble Coin app and choose the hardware wallet to install it on. Then I just have to follow the instructions on screen to finish installing the app. And once it's installed, I'll go back to the Ledger Live Desktop repo to download the desktop software. I'll download the Linux version since I'm using Linux. I'll skip ahead to once the software is installed and opened. Once you're in Ledger Live Desktop, you can add a MimbleWimble Coin account by clicking on the Add Account button, then choose MimbleWimble Coin as the crypto asset, and follow the instructions on screen to finish adding the account. The sync step can take a while depending on your internet speed, so I'll skip ahead to when it's finished. After I've added a MimbleWimble Coin account, I can receive MimbleWimble Coin by clicking on the Receive button. This part will allow me to verify an address on my hardware wallet that's used to encrypt transactions and create payment proofs. Ledger Live Desktop can only receive MimbleWimble Coin by file, and here's where you'd enter that file's contents. There's also buttons to scan a QR code and open a file. Now I'll head over to TradeOgre to send some MimbleWimble Coin to Ledger Live Desktop. I'll click the Withdraw button and enter an amount and enter a two-factor authentication code. Now I can download a transaction file from TradeOgre and open that file in Ledger Live Desktop to start processing the transaction. This step can take a while since the hardware wallet needs to generate a proof. Once it's done, I'm presented with the transaction response, which I'll need to upload to TradeOgre to finalize the transaction. There's options to copy or save the transaction response to a file. I'll choose the latter. Now I'll upload the file to TradeOgre and click the Finalize button to finalize the transaction. Back in Ledger Live, I can view the transaction details. I'll skip ahead to when the transaction is confirmed on the blockchain. Now I'll show how to send MimbleWimble Coin with Ledger Live Desktop. I'll start by clicking on the Send button. Ledger Live Desktop supports sending MimbleWimble Coin to HTTP, HTTPS, Onion services, and by file. TradeOgre only supports receiving by file, so I'll choose to send as file. I'll enter an amount and proceed through the prompts. Once Ledger Live Desktop is done preparing the file, I'm presented with the transaction's contents that I'll need to upload to TradeOgre. I'll save the transaction to a file. I'll click the Deposit button in TradeOgre. Then I'll upload the transaction file and click the Submit button to get the transaction response from TradeOgre. Now I'll save the response and open it with Ledger Live Desktop so that I can finalize the transaction. I'll approve the transaction on my hardware wallet to finish finalizing the transaction. I can view the transaction details just like before. And that's how to send and receive MimbleWimble Coin with Ledger Live Desktop. As you saw toward the beginning of this video, there's 3 other apps for the hardware wallet that this version of Ledger Live Desktop also supports: the MimbleWimble Coin floonet, Grin, and Grin testnet apps. These apps are all dependent on the MimbleWimble Coin app, so they can only be installed once the MimbleWimble Coin app is installed on the hardware wallet. I'll briefly show how to install the Grin app and how to send and receive Grin with it. I'll go back to the web installer and click on the Grin button to install the Grin app on my hardware wallet. I'll follow the instructions on screen to finish installing the Grin app. I can now add a Grin account in Ledger Live Desktop in the same way that I added a MimbleWimble Coin account earlier. I'll skip ahead to once the account is finished syncing, since that part can take a while. After the Grin account is created, I can receive Grin by clicking on the Receive button. Now in TradeOgre, I'll withdraw some Grin and receive it with Ledger Live Desktop. TradeOgre allows Grin transactions to be copied and pasted, so I'll copy the transaction contents from TradeOgre and paste them into Ledger Live Desktop to start processing the transaction. Once again, this part can take a while since the hardware wallet needs to generate a proof. Once it's done processing the transaction, I can copy the transaction response from Ledger Live Desktop and paste it into TradeOgre. Then I can click the Finalize button to finalize the transaction. In Ledger Live Desktop, I'll wait until the transaction is confirmed on the blockchain before showing how to send Grin using Ledger Live Desktop. To send Grin, I'll click on the Send button and choose to send as file. I'll enter the amount to send and proceed through the prompts. Once the transaction has been prepared, I'll copy the transaction contents from Ledger Live Desktop into TradeOgre. Then I'll copy the response from TradeOgre into Ledger Live Desktop to start finalizing the transaction. Then I'll approve the transaction on my hardware wallet to finish finalizing the transaction. And that's how to send and receive Grin with Ledger Live Desktop. One last thing, if you want to use the MimbleWimble Coin floonet and Grin testnet apps for testing or development purposes, then you'll need to enable developer mode in Ledger Live Desktop. To do that, click on the Settings button, go to the Experimental Features section, and enable developer mode. Now the MimbleWimble Coin floonet and Grin testnet options will be available when adding an account in Ledger Live Desktop.